And thank you all for coming to join us here. As Nisha said, my name is Chris Head. For the past several years, Linda McMullen and I, along with Ruth Ellen Josselson, have been serving on the curriculum task force for SQIP. So while working on a variety of curricular initiatives, we came to appreciate the importance of undergraduate general research methods textbooks. For teachers who are not knowledgeable of qualitative inquiry, the textbooks they order for their research methods courses may serve as their primary basis for understanding. If their textbooks present an inadequate or problematic presentation of qualitative inquiry, they may be ill-equipped to offer an alternative presentation. On the other hand, for teachers who might be well-versed in qualitative inquiry or sympathetic to qualitative inquiry, they may find that their teaching is tethered to the textbooks they use. We suspect that they face the challenge of finding and selecting text that adequately integrate qualitative and quantitative approaches to research. So in thinking about both situations, we realized that we needed to make these sorts of texts central to the work we do on behalf of SQIP. The first step, we reasoned, was to develop a baseline understanding of what is being presented in contemporary research methods textbooks. So to do so, we drew from inspiration from a research project Josh Clegg did and sampled the best-selling general psychology research methods textbooks in 2 prominent online booksellers. Then we recruited a team of emerging qualitative researchers to develop a methodological approach, construct some areas of interest, and examine these texts. Soon, Javier Rizzo will discuss what this team of student researchers did and what they found. To convey the origins of this gathering, however, I'm going to back up a little bit. Once the students presented us with their findings, we were left trying to figure out how to make sense of the findings and how to present them in a way that spoke to our curricular mission. Rather than merely echoing familiar critiques, such as the lack of representation of qualitative inquiry or the deficiency of conventional epistemological approaches, we wanted to offer constructive feedback about how qualitative and quantitative approaches could be integrated. What we came up with felt was fairly insufficient. And so we sought the wisdom of others who have been thinking deeply about the integration of methodology and epistemology for a long time. And so today we'll hear from 3 of those scholars. But first, Javier Rizzo will present the work he and his colleagues did on behalf of SQIP. Neil Kingston will then articulate how post-positivism can be better woven into undergraduate research methods textbooks. Then Lisa Osbeck will discuss how different epistemic values can be more effectively presented. Joshua Clegg will then discuss how historical factors underpinning psychological research can be introduced in these texts. And finally, Linda McMullen will provide a brief synthesis and will facilitate a discussion with you all. We recorded a similar talk for the 2021 APA convention, but without an adequate opportunity to engage in conversation, we felt that more is needed. And so this is why we're doing this, to hopefully invite you all into the conversation. That said, we hope the panelist talks spark your interest and set the stage for what we hope is a lively discussion. With that said, I'll now turn it over to Javier.
Thanks, Chris. Yeah, my name is Javier. I'm a grad student at UMass Boston in the clinical psychology program. I'm going to go ahead and start sharing my screen. Let's see. Let me know. How is the? Are we okay?
Yes.
Can you see my?
Yep.
Okay. Awesome. Okay, so great. As Chris mentioned, we're here to present some of the work that we did as part of the SQIP curriculum task force. You know, the thing is, as grad students, we often teach undergraduate psychology classes, and including those focused on research methods. And you know, as we come to learn about qualitative research, at least I have, you know, I've wanted a way to include them in my classroom. And in fact, I'm going to be teaching that in the fall. So this is very timely in a lot of ways. Looking at these textbooks, we're aware that they often represent the paradigms of disciplines and reflect what students are actually learning about in science and what it means to do research in psychology. So this is such a great way of kind of understanding that paradigm. So again, to get a sense for the landscape of the curriculum, the three of us conducted a content analysis of 9 popular US textbooks to introductory research methods directed towards psychology majors, and with our aim being to identify how students are introduced to scientific inquiry more generally in psychological research, and how qualitative research plays into this in our field in psychology. And we wanted to do this, again, as Chris said, to offer constructive feedback to authors, publishers, and instructors on how qualitative and quantitative methods can be best integrated together. So, how we just, as a discipline, define what science is and how to do good science is actually really important. And, we know that psychology is not just one type of science. And I think we owe it to our discipline to expand our scope of what phenomenon is possible to explore using the scientific method. I've been very aware, and I'm sure a lot of people in the audience, that many psychologists and much of the public see American psychology as a natural science, with the experiment as the gold standard of the scientific method. Articles in the recent years have evaluated the current state of psychological science through the analysis of undergrad research methods textbooks, and largely found a latent positivist approach to scientific methodology, probably not surprising for any of us. And the thing is, if we're committed to building a methodologically diverse field, our evolving understanding of methods and their philosophical underpinnings must be taught to a new generation of psychologists. So, again, many would say we're kind of in the midst of a qualitative renaissance in psychology. In particular, for instance, the APA published its first journal article reporting standards for qualitative and mixed methods research in psychology a few years ago, which was the most downloaded article in all APA published journals in 2018, and was the most cited article in the American Psychologist in 2019. So again, and just recently, the last publication manual, APA included guidance on reporting qualitative research in its publication, in that manual for the first time. So that's very exciting. And I think this is also shown too in the number of new scientific societies dedicated to qualitative inquiry around the world in psychology. So of course, SQIP is one of them. But if we look in 2005, for instance, the British Psychological Society created a similar section, which has since become their largest. And we also have the creation of the Association of European Qualitative Researchers in Psychology, or SQIP. And I think this attests to the interest in qualitative research even outside of the Anglosphere. So again, in the summer of 2020, we acquired these 9 textbooks, and emulating the method done by Dr. Clegg, we reviewed the philosophy of science in these different textbooks. So you can actually see the textbooks that were a part of our sample. And I'm going to go ahead and present some of our main findings. So an intentional discussion, we're talking about philosophy of science here, an intentional discussion of ontology, which is oftentimes a very common word within philosophy, was just largely absent from the textbooks. And even the word itself, ontology, wasn't used. We did not find it. Though ontological claims were often made by authors that implicitly reference the nature of reality. So you can see 2 examples that illustrate an understanding of reality as is existing independently of human awareness or understanding, and science's unique ability to access this truth, even if it is imperfect. We also see another implicit reference to reality made in the textbooks discussion on determinism, or the premise that events, including psychological ones, have causes that can be discovered through science, the scientific method. And these examples suggest that readers are presented with realism and determinism as the default approach to scientific inquiry early on in these textbooks, like the first few chapters. And there's just no presentation of other ontological perspectives in these textbooks around that area. So things like relativism, for instance. When we talk about epistemology, right, the theory of knowledge, there are intentional discussions of epistemology and knowledge production, but they were very limited across the textbooks and little to no description of the types of epistemology. So the terms positivism, constructivism, critical realism, that kind of thing, are just not mentioned. And most of these textbooks referenced, when they did talk about epistemology, talked about knowledge in order to distinguish scientific knowledge from other forms of knowledge. So things like authority, knowledge gained from logic or personal experience or intuition. And, although based on empirical knowledge, what we did see was that oftentimes the scientific method was further distinguished from personal experience by a systemic approach to research. And throughout nearly all the textbooks analyzed, empirical knowledge as it pertains to the scientific method was said again and again by authors to be limited to observable and measurable behavior. So taking a more or less behaviorist stance to research. So the textbooks primarily relied on positivist terminology with a major focus on hypothesis testing, quantification, and statistical procedures as primary tools for developing scientific knowledge. That it equated with higher standard of knowledge production above and beyond what can be known as a result of human interpretation and engagement. So for example, several textbooks define and organize the scientific around a hypothesis testing model. So when they talked about the scientific method, it was the hypothesis testing model. A surprising finding was that there was really minimal explicit discussion of mixed methods research across these textbooks. So it seems that despite authors' claims of the richness that can result from combining qualitative and quantitative methods, as a standalone subject, it really didn't prepare students to integrate these diverse methodologies, and just no discussion beyond just saying it was great to do or a good thing to do. So qualitative methods, often get regulated. What we found was that they got regulated to specific sections in a text rather than being integrated throughout the textbook. So in contrast to these general assumptions of realism and determinism, these dedicated qualitative chapters in two of the textbooks briefly mention that the nature of reality was something contested. So realism wasn't the only thing there. These examples suggest to us that readers may be introduced to more nuanced discussions about reality once they reach a dedicated section on qualitative inquiry. However, that might not come until much later in a chapter, in a textbook, and presumably later in a class. So they've already sort of solidified their understanding of science. And this is just like a little bit of an adjunct. These passages, while offering readers the opportunity to consider that there are different perspectives of reality and research, were just very brief, mentioned separately from the initial discussions of reality, as I was telling you about earlier, and were rarely accompanied by examples or any sort of skill building activities. Again, data analysis continued to be equated with statistical procedures, and even when they did talk about qualitative research, they oftentimes talked about the quantification of qualitative data, so you could use statistics. So, again, across these textbooks, we found discussion of philosophy of science in psychological knowledge production were just minimal, implicit, and biased towards quantitative modes of inquiry, realism, and positivism. And thinking about the consequences for student textbook readers are, one, we think a minimal exposure to research questions outside of hypothesis testing. Two, an inability to assess quality and rigor of research beyond, validity and reliability, which are more quantitative measures anyway, and an insufficient training in reflexivity about one's own methodological decision-making. So that was not something really emphasized. The focus on quantitative methods elsewhere, these questions about whether readers of these textbooks learn that qualitative inquiry is in fact a practice that produces scientific knowledge. Much of these textbooks don't really give the reader a sense of the meaning on philosophical issues, as noted by Dr. Clegg in his 2016 article. Even within a historical perspective, with science being seen as a dynamic human endeavor and incorporating scholarship from history and philosophy of science. So from these findings, we had a number of recommendations for textbook publishers, again, authors and instructors, but I'm just going to report a few that provide a more robust introduction to philosophical issues relating to the implications on methodological decision-making. And we hope that these lead to more integration of both quantitative and qualitative approaches in these methods classes. For one, we would love to see an increase in the coverage of philosophy of science as a topic in and of itself, especially in the history of qualitative inquiry in psychology. We'd like to see a discussion more of how qualitative inquiry has contributed to psychological knowledge, its history of reception and recognition by colleagues, and the future goals of qualitative inquiry. We'd also recommended an increase in presenting instruction and skill development related to qualitative analysis. So things like helping students learn pattern recognition in qualitative data, learning how to code qualitative data, building claims from qualitative data itself, and training students to approach research questions with a multi-methodological toolkit. We also really recommend that organizing curriculum is done around the main tasks and problems of research methods more generally, rather than siphoning off qualitative research in its own chapter and just sort of leaving it at that. When we talk about sampling in a textbook, maybe talking about sampling in qualitative research, or generalization from a qualitative perspective, which I know there have been some really amazing papers published lately, and talking about reflexivity, the position of the scientist in all of this. So although we introduced, although this was introduced after all of these versions of the textbooks were analyzed and published, we recommend that the introduction of the framework of methodological integrity be included, as well as the APA Journal article reporting standards for qualitative mixed methods research. So there we go. I'm going to go ahead and get my slideshow there, and great.
Hello, I'm Neil Kingston, and I'm going to try to share my screen. It is my hope that you now all see the screen. Someone shout or something if you can't.
We
in
see
any
it.
case, great. In any case, my colleagues and I did a paper that I would suggest is quite complementary to the research that you just heard. But rather than looking at a quantitative versus qualitative lens, we looked at positivism versus post-positivism, and that was especially appropriate since we focused just on statistics texts. So I didn't expect to find a lot about quantitative research, but I do think some of the themes that have led to the rise of qualitative research should be addressed. Comte, who coined the term sociology, also created positivism, which he defined as the search for invariant laws of the natural and social world through observation, experimentation, and comparison. Logical positivism was an extension of positivism developed by the members of the Vienna Circle between 1924 and 1936. Logical positivism posited that only statements verifiable through direct observation or logical proof were meaningful, and that the truth was out there waiting to be discovered. Logical positivism is like the X-Files of philosophy. In 1935, Karl Popper observed that all knowledge is provisional, conjectural, hypothetical. We can never finally prove our scientific theories. We can merely provisionally confirm or conclusively refute them. This is the basis of logical positivism and is widely recognized as the primary epistemological basis for all social science. One might argue for all science. While statistical testing is more than 300 years old, its modern formalization stems from the early 20th century, preceding the formalization of post-positivism. Nonetheless, null hypothesis statistical significance testing is consistent with post-positivism, at least in theory. One can never prove the null hypothesis is true. One can only reject it or fail to reject it. Failing to reject it in no way means it's true. With a small enough sample size, one usually fails to reject the null hypothesis, even if an alternative hypothesis is true. One can say a particular alternative hypothesis is more likely than the null hypothesis, but not that it's true. One never knows precise truth from statistical inference. One can only put likely brackets, confidence intervals around truth. Even with Bayesian inference, one cannot know truth. One only knows the credible interval where truth is likely to be found, and that depends on the reasonableness of your prior distribution. In the October 2014 issue of the American Psychologist, Alice Eagerly and Stephanie Rigger reviewed 10 psychology research methods texts in an article entitled Feminism and Psychology, Critiques of Methods and Epistemology. In their article, they discussed the transition of scientific research from a positivistic to post-positivistic epistemology. I won't go through their key findings. I'll simply say that there's been more research of this kind, including the study that was just discussed by Javier, and probably more is necessary. In this study, we chose 5 undergraduate psychology statistics texts with the largest sales volumes per Amazon, and also 5 specific schools, and identified the text they used. We did this in order to diversify the sampling frame. 2 of the schools, Arizona State University and University of Virginia, used the same text. So our analysis was based on 9 textbooks. We requested and received from the publishers electronic versions of all texts. In advance of our analysis, we chose 41 search terms, and the results were none of the texts mentioned positivism, logical positivism, or post-positivism. Most texts discussed how statistics never prove anything with certainty, thank goodness, that they at least did that. Only 5 of the textbooks explicitly stated that researchers never can prove the null hypothesis is true. This was outstandingly problematic for those that didn't, I believe. Only 5 textbooks explicitly stated that a sample might not be representative of the population of interest. Only 1 textbook explicitly stated the importance of the human context surrounding the research study. Like research methods texts, statistics texts pay almost no explicit attention to epistemology. I believe this leaves the understanding of statistical analysis with a shaky foundation. I will argue that shakiness is evident in the majority of research studies I have peer-reviewed for journals that are not focused on research methods. Also, I find too many graduate students and early career researchers with whom I have interacted and who do specialize in quantitative methods pay little or no attention to the subject matter and context of the data they are analyzing. I am shocked and dismayed that many statistics texts are not unambiguously clear that one never accepts the null hypothesis. Separate, but a larger concern than how poorly null hypothesis testing, significance testing is presented at all, is that it remains the dominant paradigm for undergraduate and graduate psychology statistics courses. For 60 years, an increasing majority of leading statisticians have pointed out the problems with null hypothesis significance testings. Some quotes follow. Statistical significance testing is based upon a fundamental misunderstanding of the nature of rational inference and is seldom, if ever, appropriate to the aims of scientific research. Roseboom in 1960. Statistical significance is perhaps the least important attribute of a good experiment. It is never a sufficient condition for claiming that a theory has been usefully corroborated, that a meaningful empirical fact has been established, or that an experimental report ought to be published, like in 1968. I suggest to you that Sir Ronald Fisher has befuddled us, mesmerized us, and led us down the primrose path. I believe that the almost exclusive reliance on merely refuting the null hypothesis as the standard method for corroborating substantive theories. It is a terrible mistake, is basically unsound, poor scientific strategy, and one of the worst things that has ever happened in the history of psychology. I am not making some nitpicking statistician's correction. I'm saying the whole business is so radically defective as to be scientifically almost pointless. Rothman, 1986, testing for statistical significance continues today not on its merits as a methodological tool, but on the momentum of tradition. Rather than serving as a thinker's tool, it has become some clumsy substitute for thought, subverting what should be a contemplative exercise into an algorithm prone to error. Rothman, I said that before. Logically and conceptually, the use of statistical significance testing in the analysis of research data has been thoroughly discredited. Schmidt and Hunter. Our unfortunate historical commitments to significance tests force us to rephrase good questions in the negative, attempt to reject those nullities, and be left with nothing we can logically say about the questions. Clean, 2005. So what's wrong with null hypothesis significance testing? That ought to be expressed in our statistics books. We want to know the probability that a hypothesis is true given the data we have, but null hypothesis significance testing tells us the probability of the data given the null hypothesis is true. It's sensitive to sample size. It's always wrong. Typically, type 2 error is way too high, low power. It's often misinterpreted as the probability of the results due to chance, or 95% chance of replicability, or 5% chance of making a type 1 error, or supporting an alternative hypothesis. A focus on confidence intervals, or perhaps better yet, Bayesian credible intervals, would form a sounder basis for statistical inference, and one that can be more clearly seen as connected to post-positivistic reasoning. Unfortunately, only one of the 9 texts that we analyzed did this. Recommendations. Every textbook on statistics and research methods, for that matter, should discuss its epistemological basis in the introductory chapter. Discuss issues of subjectivity and context in the framing of research questions, collecting of data, and data analysis. Focus should be on confidence intervals rather than null hypothesis significance testing. And if you insist on focusing on null hypothesis significance testing, make sure students understand that you never accept the null hypothesis. If you have any questions or comments or want to see the full PowerPoint, please feel free to contact me, neil.kingston@ku.edu. Thank you.
Thank you, Neil, and thank you, Chris and Anisha, for your organizational efforts. It's really great to be a part of the symposium. I'm really excited by the prospect of trying to involve history and philosophy of science into the teaching of methods at the undergraduate level, especially. And so I really appreciate the spirit of this. Let me just share my screen and begin. My enthusiasm, I will say, though, is tempered a little bit. So it's cautious enthusiasm, and my cautions are several. So first, it's just really a concern about the complexity of the subject matter and the risk of reducing whole traditions to caricatures of themselves. So I think descriptions in textbooks can be inherently problematic and reductive. Ideally, students need exposure to original source materials in philosophy of science and exposure to the broader context of ideas, historical context, but also the broader intellectual context of the ideas. They need exposure to variations within traditions and frameworks, so varieties of realism, relativism, positive, for example, rather than just thinking of these as monolithic kinds of things. And then I think, there must be ideally room for informed understanding and critique of both traditional and alternative methods, qualitative methods. And just from Neil's presentation, we could see quite easily that in addition to just conceptual framework understandings, it's important to really focus on the misuses of logic, appropriate uses and misuses of statistical methods, for example, what Lamiel recently called interpretive malpractice. This is distinct, I think, from the general problems with quantification of human phenomena that are sometimes the focus of philosophical discussions on methods. But one of the problems is that students may lack the language, they may lack the background to even engage in these kinds of discussions. And so we risk just kind of losing them because they can't even get started in the conversation. Kathleen Slaney recently made this point, that students lack the concepts to be even able to understand the arguments or to read the original sources that would be necessary for a richer understanding of the backgrounds of the traditions that we're presenting to them. And also, realistically, how many instructors feel adequately prepared? How many feel willing to engage students at the level of detail that would be required to have a really informed discussion that I think is doing justice to the subject matter we're trying to present? All of these things are concerns of mine. And then I think we also need to acknowledge that just having the exposure to the theories is not in itself likely to impact practice. We know this at both a system level and at an individual level, the level of the student. At the system level, Lamiel and Slaney recently dedicated an edited volume that basically is a series of takes on the problem that, despite all the critiques over the years, methodological critiques, practices remain more or less unchanged. So very little is happening at the system level, despite all of these things that have been launched over the years as a critical informative analysis of problematic practices. Then at the personal or student level, we all know that reason isn't what drives the bus of practice, right? Emotion, identity, a sense of belonging, a sense of community, getting approval for our work, opportunities that are available, all of those are going to have more sway ultimately over what students end up doing, what they end up putting into practice. So for all these reasons, I think it's important for us to try to think about how to engage students around these ideas, but to think in terms of whole person concepts when considering how to do so. And for me, discussion of values is a whole person kind of approach. I think values are a whole person concept. They're personal and social, they're emotional and cognitive, unconscious and conscious, motivating, inhibiting, unifying, and divisive. As Wolfgang Köhler said in The Place of Value in a World of Fact, they are intrinsic to all we do. At the bottom of all human activities are values. And in my personal experience, I've found that students can more easily engage in reflection on their values, their own values, their moral values, the values with which they were raised, for example, and they're able to engage in some reflection on disciplinary traditions and disciplinary values, and comparing their own values with the values of the discipline they are pursuing, for example. And even engaging in discussion of this kind, discussing a discussion of values in relation to a discipline like psychology, actually engages them in philosophical discussion. It helps them realize that the value-free ideal has long been rejected by philosophers of science, who instead focus more recently on what kind of values do influence science and what values in particular are good for science or good for inquiry of any kind. But even discussion of values, of course, can be tricky. It requires a kind of delicate approach, in part because values are a notoriously vague category. George Howard said they're a catch-all for an enormous array of very different judgments, decisions, preferences, and orientations. Jeltveit called them remarkably elastic, put to use by various stockholders in a wide assortment of ways. But that said, different definitions typically converge around an integration of, on one hand, emotion or desire, and on the other, some form of appraisal or judgment or evaluation. Some examples here: things that are felt to be important, something desirable or worthy of pursuit. And in Allport's original psychological study, the emphasis was on both motivation and evaluation. So, integrating these two is the important thing to get across, I believe. And then, as I mentioned, philosophers of science have been talking about different categories of value for some time now and making distinctions, applying different schemas for distinguishing kinds of value, with the most basic being the distinction between epistemic and non-epistemic. This is, of course, in itself controversial. Epistemic typically thought to concern things related to adequacy of evidence, logical strategy, appropriate inferential strategy, truth claims, and non-epistemic then includes everything else. That's the controversial part. It's like a grab bag, right? Everything gets loaded together in the non-epistemic, when in fact these are very different value kinds in their own right. But the important thing, I think, is to relay that value kinds relate to different concerns, and also that they do not align with methods or cohere in regular or straightforward ways. So no single tradition, no single method has a monopoly on any value category. And I want to give just some examples for the sake of illustration here. Traditional scientific methods, while they are no longer perhaps concerned with landing on truth have traditionally been associated with trying to attain an accurate picture of the world in some way. I'm going way back, of course, to ancient natural philosophy into early 20th century, but this idea of trying to get an accurate picture, at least progressively accurate picture, has been a value. That's epistemic, but for some, especially historically, that's also been a kind of spiritual value in its own right. Kepler is a great example of that. Then authority, epistemic authority is a value because it can provide a basis for trust, for guidance in living. That's practical, that's even moral, in addition to epistemic. Predictive power, enabling problem solving, is moral, practical, as well as epistemic. And connection of discovery to mystery or exploration has an aesthetic dimension. In a sense, that's an aesthetic value. Qualitative methods, on the other hand, also have epistemic value, enhanced understanding through multiple perspectives, deep local knowledge, for example. May have practical values like more limited scope, have moral values, of course, like giving a voice to those who are traditionally underrepresented or oppressed, and aesthetic value of creative expression, narrative beauty, and so on. But again, no one tradition has a monopoly on any one of these categories. An important concept that Curler introduces is that values are associated with requiredness. They establish a limited set of actions, we could say procedures, capable of instantiating the values in any kind of inquiry. So for example, a value of simplicity of account and a value of giving voice, belonging perhaps to different value categories, have different sets of requiredness. Those different sets of requiredness pose different demands on the inquiry, on the methods, on the procedures. So I think it's useful to construe methodological traditions as value systems with different sets of requiredness, complex interactions of values, not just a single value, but systems. Nevertheless, they have distinct normative frameworks, dissimilar underlying assumptions, different historically sanctioned values leading to choices of procedure, goal, and standards, but all with different constraints on inquiry. What I think is valuable about this is that it helps to steer away from teaching methods with implicit hierarchies communicated, right? The idea that some methods are inherently more rigorous, more scientific, or better across the board, and establishing these kinds of problems that we all know in the perceived legitimacy of certain values that qualitative researchers might hold dear in particular. The problem, though, with this, if we stick too rigidly to an understanding of methods as value systems, is that it can lead to a kind of siloing, right? To a kind of embracing of one's own value system, and the assumption that my value system is incommensurate with yours and incommensurable with yours. That's good for some purposes, but it's not very good for collaboration, right? If we have this attitude that I have this value set of this set of values, this value system, it's different from yours, and I don't need to care whether you understand that or not, and I don't need to understand your value system. That can be quite problematic if our goal is to have any kind of integration, any kind of cooperative participation. And it's not just that integration is a nice thing, it's good to cooperate and collaborate. Increasingly, people who study interdisciplinarity as an object in itself, an academic pursuit, a discursive object of interdisciplinarity, emphasize that it's the only way humans are going to be able to confront these immense problems that are facing us, these immense messes that we are in, that are so complex. They are going to require new concepts, new hybrid models that come from combining different perspectives on the problem, different disciplinary perspectives. but also different perspectives within a discipline like psychology. So how do we do this? How do we understand methods as value systems, but still try to facilitate understanding across value systems? That is what I see is the central problem. And I want to just leave with three very basic suggestions. First, those who study values in science these days repeatedly emphasize the importance of trying to communicate openly about values, explore our own values, and try to understand the values of others. Michael O'Rourke, a philosopher of science at Michigan State University, is a philosopher of communication, holds workshops in what he calls the Toolbox Project, in which he tries to get people with different values to communicate with one another and help one another understand where they're coming from, people from different disciplinary perspectives, for example. I think it's also possible to cultivate perspective taking in students, which comes, I think, from helping them really try to put themselves in the position of different traditions, right? Scholars coming from different traditions with different agendas, and not just to dig in and solidify their own values, but really try to seek to have empathy with different traditions that may at first not seem compatible with their own, but with some effort they can be kind of led to understand. And then, as I've tried to point out here, I think more fine-grained analysis of values in different value categories can be helpful. And I think doing so may reveal some common ground. So, for example, psychologists who don't share epistemic values, you might have one set of psychologists very interested in deep local knowledge and another with much more general knowledge, trying to come together. They may be united by a common interest, or common moral value, right? Both trying to alleviate human suffering. Barbara Held recently pointed out that psychologists with very different epistemic values may share an underlying value of social justice, even though they go about trying to pursue that aim in very different ways. So just to conclude, discussion of value differences and commonly held values. So again, what's different and what's in common may both enhance our philosophical understanding of methods and bear fruit in practice by helping to establish grounds for collaboration, both within and between disciplines at a time when this is really necessary. And just a few resources on values in science for anybody interested. Thank you very much.
Okay, I think it's my turn. All right, well, hi everybody. I think it's possible that I might add very little to this. That's the peril of going last. It's seem derivative. That's okay. I'm going to try and not talk too long. We gave a version of this at APA, and what I'm going to say is a little bit different. I didn't tell Chris that, so what he said I was going to say is not exactly what I'm going to say. But I'll try to skip through things that are a bit repetitive, maybe. So the original kind of question that brought us together was how do we integrate qualitative, quantitative methods instruction at the undergraduate level? Or anyway, that's what I think inspired Chris to kind of organize this. And I think we all understand that this is a challenge, not just because these aren't just like different techniques, they are, different approaches that come from very different worldviews, epistemic, assumptions, and so on. That creates a real challenge for integration. And kind of the main point I want to make today is that this challenge isn't really a matter of integrating two different and opposed worldviews or two different kind of communities of practice. Rather, in psychology, just like in other sciences, other disciplines, there's kind of a plurality of epistemic subcultures. And these have amorphous and porous borders. So it's not really about like these two, nations that we're trying to get together, right? The challenge is really that we have a complex terrain that we have to learn to navigate. And that's that title I put there on the front of my presentation there, epistemic transcultural competence. This is a mouthful, but this is the concept that I want to talk about today. And I think this is the kind of competence that we need to navigate this really complex terrain. So let me just start by saying a few words about my starting assumption, and use an example, a couple of examples to show what I'm trying to say. So I think this is sort of what you see on the screen there is kind of the way that we are, like a textbook account of the difference between qualitative and quantitative. It's set up as sort of an antimony opposition. And quantitative evidence is sort of painted as about counts and measurements. Qualitative is about natural language. Quantitative warrant is about statistically meaningful variable relationships. Qualitative warrant is about contextually thick representative descriptions. But I think if we look at particular examples of methods and methodological traditions, we can see that that kind of dichotomy doesn't really hold up. Like, for example, the experience sampling tradition. There are some kind of sub disciplines inside experience sampling that are really much closer to using counts and measurements as their primary form of evidence, and doing like statistical analysis as how they create warrant for their claims. But there are other versions of experience sampling that are much more like, say, phenomenological analysis, right? They use natural language, and there's some that are kind of in the middle. So like this is a particular disciplinary geography, locality that doesn't neatly fit into either quantitative or qualitative. And I would say that that's really the norm, that's the rule rather than the exception. I think if we look at quantitative and qualitative, it's more of a gradient, right? You see and in fact, I'm not even sure that gradient necessarily is even a particularly useful gradient for explaining the epistemological geography of psychology. But just some examples that I think we're all familiar with. For example, in quantitative traditions in social psychology, if you're publishing in a journal like the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology, you're probably going to see a lot of null hypothesis significance testing in there. But if you publish in a journal like Journal of Basic and Applied Social Psychology, you're not going to see as much of that. And in fact, the editors of the journal some years ago said they weren't going to even accept NHST in that journal anymore. I think they've probably softened that stance at this point, but the effects of it remain. You're much less likely to see that. So that's like an epistemological regionality inside a quantitative tradition that are actually quite different from each other. And so that overlaps with some experience sampling traditions. And if you look on the other side of my qualitative methods, you have traditions like, say, discourse analysis or phenomenology that really think about what talk is and how one draws conclusions from talk in really different ways. And sometimes I've been in the middle of fights between discourse analysts and phenomenologists on that very topic. Yeah, in fact, quite a few times. So it's not like we have these, separate nations. We have complex shifting terrain. And the larger point that I'm making is that this is the norm, not just in psychology, but in science, is that you have a plurality of epistemic regionalities. And they have varying standards for what constitutes acceptable procedure, evidence, warrant. So our real challenge as teachers and as people have to live in these spaces is not how to integrate qualitative and quantitative. It's a bigger and more complex issue. Our challenge is how do we traverse this incredibly complicated and shifting epistemic terrain? So I want to say a couple words about what I think we shouldn't do. And they're things that we very often do, or anyway, in methods texts and in undergraduate curriculum, these are strategies that are often taken to deal with this epistemic plurality that I think are not good strategies. So one I'm calling epistemic isolation. So this is basically a curriculum that covers just like one scientific method, doesn't mention alternative views. I would say that this approach is not as common as it once was. I think I've read a lot, for various reasons, a lot of contemporary methods textbooks, and I would say that this is not all that common in contemporary methods textbooks. Most people are not trying to deny that there is epistemic and methodological plurality in psychology. A second strategy, much more common one, is an epistemic assimilation. So this is where a curriculum acknowledges alternative views, but it ultimately integrates all these under a unified view of science. So they'll have universal standards that they'll consider universal, like something like, say, validity or reliability. And these will be applied to all approaches, even those that explicitly reject those standards. So it's an attempt to kind of eliminate or subsume epistemic plurality under just one general episteme. I would say that in the methods text that I've seen, this is the most common strategy. There's science is presented as this thing we all agree about, we all know how science works, and this is what science is. And then those methods or those epistemological traditions that don't necessarily fit, we sort of gloss over or ignore the fact that they don't fit. And then one last strategy that I see happen more often now is what I'm calling epistemic appropriation. This is basically an eclectic approach. So you treat methods kind of like a toolbox that are made up of interchangeable techniques, and you can use them without the need for any kind of socialization into a community of practice or into some kind of epistemological foundation. And so this is basically an attempt to ignore or minimize epistemic plurality. So it acknowledges methodological plurality, but it then extracts those methods from the native epistemic context. So for various reasons, I think all of these strategies are problematic. I think they don't really prepare students for the actual epistemic plurality that they're going to encounter when they get into the field, because that's the reality. The reality is there's lots of different methods and lots of different ideas about truth and how science works and how you do research in psychology. And I think students and all of us need to be prepared for that. And we need to have skills to kind of thoughtfully, critically engage with that reality and know how to handle those different kinds of methodological traditions. And so what I'm arguing, this is my main point, and I'll try not to say too much more about it, is that the kind of set of skills or competency that we need is something like epistemic transcultural competence. So let me just say a couple words about what I mean by that, and then I will try to be done soon. So I'm using that word transcultural. It's kind of in contradistinction to acculturation, because acculturation is sort of traditionally associated with assimilation, right? Where you have like one kind of general worldview and everybody kind of has to like figure out how to live with it. But transculturation is more about learning how to move within and between cultures, how to build hybridities between cultures, how to build sort of like skills and facility to understand and move within and between different cultures, right? And so in the context of thinking about epistemic cultures in psychology, I think that's what we need to be good at, and what we need to help our students be good at is how do we move fluently across these different epistemic geographies that we find, right? You know, we need to be able to understand what someone's doing when they do an ANOVA, and also what they're doing when they do a thematic analysis, right? We need to be able to make sense of what, you know, different practices and different discourses mean and how they're used, right? So, I mean, that's, of course, a very high bar, right? I mean, how could you know all that, right? I think there's so much epistemic complexity in psychology, even with the tendencies towards, you know, forcing everybody into a single sort of approach. I think there still is a huge amount of variability. And nobody can master all the methods. Nobody can master all the epistemic discourses that are a part of psychology. It's just too much. If I wanted to teach my students about all of them, I couldn't, because I don't know even a fraction of them. I don't have enough experience with all those different regionalities to meaningfully teach my students about them. So I think, but what we can do for our students and for ourselves is we can develop strategies and skills for kind of learning and interrogating new geographies that we end up moving through, right? So all of us are going to move through a bunch of different epistemic geographies over the course of a career. And, you know, I think what we really need is skills that help us like live inside those, make sense of those, work with them, learn them quickly, interrogate them effectively. And, you know, I think the best way that I found to do that for myself and for my students is developing skills in what I would call like metadisciplinary studies. So this includes things like meta-science, critical epistemological analysis, and in particular, historical analysis, I think has probably been the most useful tool for me for really figuring out how to navigate different epistemic regionalities. So if we develop some measure of skill in these different kinds of tools, we'll be able to recognize a new kind of geography when we enter it, right? We'll see an inflection that we haven't seen before, and we'll be able to put it into some kind of context, right? We'll be able to interrogate its history. We will have learned how to like look at what a particular method or a particular assumption has been used to justify. We'll be able to kind of dig around inside its assumptions, inside its epistemic and moral affordances. You know, what does this assumption commit us to? Like we can develop skills that make it so that we have a facility when we encounter these different regionalities and can know what to do with them. And I think I'm moving more and more towards trying to help my students develop those kinds of facilities. And I think that the discipline as a whole could really benefit from moving towards more rather than less. I think the trend right now is towards less like historical sophistication in undergraduate and even graduate curricula. Less theoretical sophistication, less epistemological sophistication. And I think that a lot of the points that Lisa was making about the centrality of values, I think that kind of competency to be able to like know how to understand your own values and understand and interrogate other people's values, I think you really need all this kind of like metadisciplinary skills and metadisciplinary knowledge to actually do that work. And so I guess to cut my talk short and just end here, I had some other examples that I gave in the presentation. If people want to talk about those, I can, but I'm going to just leave those off for now. And so just to sum up what I've been trying to say here, I think this challenge of dealing with qualitative and quantitative curriculum, it's better understood as a kind of a matter of epistemic transcultural competence, knowing how to navigate these different epistemic regionalities. And that if we really want to be good at that, what we need is to develop these metadisciplinary skills, metadisciplinary competence. So yeah, I can say more, but I'm going to stop there. I say a bit more about this in a recent book, so I can let people know about that if anyone's interested. But that's all I'm going to say for now.
Okay, thank you to everyone. This has been an amazing set of high-level presentations that I couldn't possibly do justice to in any kind of synthesis. I mean, I'll just highlight a couple of things, and then I think I'll just pose some questions that are maybe a bit on the pragmatic side to get us to think more about how we actually do this important project that we've been talking about today. So, Javier and Neil started out by demonstrating the inattention to epistemology in our methods texts and our statistics texts. And this is certainly not a surprise to many of us, but perhaps still a bit disheartening. Lisa and Josh have really underscored the difficulty of teaching abstract, particularly epistemological concepts, but other concepts as well, and the complexity of the subject matter that we have been talking about today, and how do we go about doing this? And all four presenters have provided suggestions for what students need to know with regard to epistemological orientations and how we can engage them in creative ways. I think that's one of the important things that's come out here is creative ways of having students engage with these ideas, not in the abstract, that can enhance their learning. So I'm just going to pose a few questions, but these are not meant to in any way circumscribe the conversation at all. They're just questions that are of interest to me. I taught an undergraduate course in qualitative inquiry for a number of years, and I really wrestled with the introduction of epistemology and ontology with them. And I took a probably very typical approach, which is to try to present these rather abstract concepts to them. And of course, in order to get to talk about constructionism, I had to entirely teach them about what objectivism was and what post-positivism was. They had really not learned, I don't think, much of that in any of their other courses, even though this was a third-year class that I was teaching. So I had to, in order to get to constructionism, I had to present the contrast, and so they could understand that better. And I used various ways of going about this, taking two different articles, one on the same topic, one that was more from an objectivist position, one that was more constructionist, trying to walk them through the language that researchers were using and trying to see where the contrasts were and to try to teach them the abstract constructs in concrete ways. So, but I really did wrestle with it, and I'm not at all sure that it worked. So I guess I'm really interested in hearing about successes and perhaps even failures that some of you have had with regard to particular exercises or ways that you've gone about this. So some of my questions are, how do we begin the process of engaging students with these concepts? Like the very first sort of introduction of all of this. These are very difficult concepts for students to understand: ontology, epistemology, subjectivity, and context. Those are some of the ones that we've talked about. What do we say about why? What's the justification? Why understanding these epistemological assumptions and other concepts and one's a commitment to them in a particular research project matters? How do we do that? Or is it more of a kind of bottom-up process where they begin to engage and they then get to see the justification for why we think this is important and we think that they should have exposure to it? I'm wondering about whether anybody has anything to say about a particular sequence of introducing concepts or assignments or of exercises. Do they work better than others? Do we start at a particular point? Have you found that a particular point of starting works better than others? Do we take a top-down approach, or do we take these abstract concepts and then particularize them, or do we take a bottom-up approach by particularizing them first and then getting to the larger concept? Do we do it side by side? So I'm curious about those kinds of questions as well. Finally, I'm of course really interested in the integrative course, and a number of you have talked about that today. And had I actually been a lot younger, I might have actually devoted myself to thinking about how we could actually do an integrative course. I think that's really an interesting question, where we can compare different epistemologies, forms of data and data analysis, looking for the differences, but also the similarities. What are the concepts that span different ways of doing research? Interpretation, for instance. How do we talk about interpretation in multiple ways? Finally, I'm really interested in how might publishers or authors of textbooks be engaged with our concerns? And to what extent really does the textbook as a pedagogical instrument still matter? I certainly never used a textbook when I was teaching my undergraduate course because there just wasn't one that worked. And so I think a lot of us that try to string together a set of readings that we think will work for students. And maybe that's the best we can do, but I'm curious about whether anybody knows about the extent of uptake of these textbooks in psychology these days, or are people moving away from them? Should we not even bother about the textbook anymore? So I'm just going to stop there, and I think we should just have a conversation about this.
I just want to answer one of those questions briefly and kind of endorse what Lisa said about values focus as a very effective way of broaching complex epistemological and methodological questions. That's the approach I use when I teach methods to master's students in particular. Is I couch complex methodological issues in moral contexts. And my students really respond to that. I can give you an example from this week. So as a reading, this is actually a paper that Michelle Fine wrote. I see you on the call there, Michelle. She wrote a paper about kind of the way that experiments sometimes decontextualize certain contexts. And in the specific example she writes about in the paper is about women who have experienced domestic violence, and the requirements of running an experiment on that context can sometimes do violence to the women themselves, right? And so the article does this in a nice subtle way. I'm not expressing it very well, but my students, I asked them to then have a discussion after they read that, and the question I asked them was when can the choice of an experimental design be a moral question? Right? I asked them to reflect on that, and then we had it was on a discussion board, an online discussion board. And the conversation was beautiful. I mean, I didn't have to do anything to make it happen. They really were not just understanding the moral issue, but they were understanding the methodological issues and the epistemological issues in a really deep way, a much deeper way than they would have if I had just tried to explain, some epistemological text. So, I really think that strategy is a very effective one for me and for my students.
And so Josh, did you like name the epistemological concept that were involved, even if they weren't spoken?
And not necessarily in that discussion, because I tried to stay out of it and let the students sort of, direct it. But yes, I think in later classes or in some of the other lectures, we talk about some of those complex concepts, but then we can refer back and say, remember this conversation we had about, women who had experienced domestic violence. This is why sometimes, we have to be careful about the methods we choose, because we don't want to decontextualize always. Sometimes that's a bad thing.
I don't have any real answers, but I can just add to some of the acknowledgement of problems. I had the advantage of briefly being a philosophy major, one of my 5 undergraduate sequential majors. So that had my head at perhaps the right space. And when I went to graduate school, I had the privilege of studying with Maxine Greene and Jonas Saltis, 2 great philosophers of science and education. It would have even been better if I had been able to do so before I took my first research methods or statistics course, but I wasn't too far lost by the time I had those courses, so it helped a lot. What I see right now, and what I don't know how to overcome, is there are a lot of very good researchers who by mid-career start putting the pieces together and understanding the importance of philosophy of science, of values, epistemology, et cetera, as the basis of everything they're doing, leading to evidentiary reasoning that I would argue the dichotomy between qualitative and quantitative methods, and even that mixed methods sort of middle ground, isn't the most useful way to look at this. In evidentiary reasoning, the specific problem you're trying to solve is going to lead you to the claims, warrants, approaches that you're going to use. And thinking of exploratory versus confirmatory research is also a helpful thing in trying to think through what are the methods and the implications of those methods. I look forward to any of you coming up with a great suggestion that I can start implementing here at the University of Kansas.
Any other comments?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I just, and I know because I'm a grad student and I'm teaching my first class, I don't really have much to add in terms of like specifics. So I'm really soaking up a lot. But one thing I remember reading that really, I think, clicked for me when I started grad school that allowed me to sort of think about methods a little differently was the idea of pragmatism as a paradigm to think about things, and that thinking about what's your ultimate aim for any particular step that you're doing in your research. And when I do mixed methods, I tend to take that viewpoint. I don't know if anyone much about that, but that's just something that seems to at least make it less of a like 2 camps sort of thing and a little bit more integrated.
And I think aims overlap with values, right? So that's very relevant to the discussion we were having earlier.
I want to also chime in on the textbook issue or lack of textbook issue. And I'm not sure if there's a chicken and egg problem here or what the problem is, but I've spent a lot of time looking for textbooks I would be happy to use and found none. And repeating the fallacious reasoning or approaches that we've had for the last 50, 60 years when it comes to statistics texts. I don't know if someone has to write a book so that then there's legitimacy and then people can point to it and feel better teaching to it, or whether we just get rid of textbooks. But if we get rid of textbooks, then it's up to each one of us individually to craft our curriculum and not to have the efficiency of having some materials on which to depend. I'm not sure what's going to work.
I will say that that textbooks are not going away. They are a massive industry. And I mean, maybe people on this call would be nodding their head to the idea of who uses textbooks anymore. But I think probably most people who work in psychology are using lots of textbooks. But to echo Neil's point, I've read a lot of methods textbooks, and I've never found one that was like, oh yeah, this is pretty good. This is making sense. Like, I mean, I'm not saying they're all bad. I'm just saying that they're all textbooks, and so they're this is who was it who wrote about this? Kuhn, right? Who wrote about how like the textbook thinking is sort of inevitable, and it's like, it's always going to be reductive, and it's always going to, you can't write a textbook without, mangling the thing that you're writing a textbook about. So, I guess maybe I'm agreeing with Neil's point there that, I mean, I guess I'm saying textbooks aren't going anywhere, and they're still a huge business, and yet they don't actually work very well. There's not that many things that they do well, frankly, so, but none of us wants to have to like create a whole curriculum ourselves either, right? So.
Well, even if we did, there are so many methods classes all over the world, right, that we can't expect everyone to design their own curriculum around some of the things that are of concern and value to us. I also have my doubts about like supplements. I mean, it might be a good idea to publish like commentary or supplements for methods texts, but methods texts in themselves are so expensive. The thought of buying a supplement on top of that and charging students for that is problematic in its own right. So I don't know what the answer is in terms of text.
Yeah, I've started just using some free online one because they all are the same, basically. There's a lot of conformity in methods text. And so there's nothing different in any one text versus another for the most part. So I just use a free one, and then it doesn't cost my students anything. And then I'm going to have to correct the deficiencies either way. So I might as well use a free one.
It just strikes me that there's a lot of really good ideas, at least in this conversation, in terms of how one goes about presenting some of this material, how one goes about engaging with students, exercises, that sort of thing. And yet we're still working in isolation. We don't really know what each other is doing. We don't have a repository where we could share these sorts of resources. I mean, I realize you can't easily sometimes take an exercise that somebody's developed and then use it yourself in the same way. But nonetheless, if we had some place where we could actually see what each other is doing and borrow from each other, that might be useful.
I also wonder if, we have about 13 minutes, if this might be a good time to take questions from the participants and the rest of the folks that are here. Is that okay with you as the panelists?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And so feel free to, each of you, either type your question into the chat or unmute yourselves and just say it out loud. And here's one from Zachary, I'll read it. How can we effectively communicate the value of epistemic plurality in psychology, particularly to quantitative psychologists, given that critiques have been limited in their effectiveness? Have any of you had success in doing so with your colleagues? Does anybody want to take that one?
A short piece of a response, and then I'll turn it to whoever wants to speak. As a person who would normally be considered a quantitative psychologist, I'm just saying it's possible. Now I'll leave it to others to say how.
So I don't know if this has been effective. I think so, but so my research is mostly in qualitative psychotherapy research, and oftentimes people sort of know me in my program as the person who like kind of rails against the idea of like evidence-based, so empirically supported treatments or something that like, a type of psychotherapy is only valid if it has, RCTs, this and many RCTs, and there's not much that you can do in terms of qualitative research just doesn't have an in there. And so I talk about what happens when you can't do that, and just really deconstructing that. I mean, I think at least when I presented on it, people have engaged with it, but also these are folks that are like my colleague, like my fellow students. So not sure how faculty necessarily respond to this, but also therapists themselves, I think, are more open to qualitative research, the people who are actually reading research than, reading RCTs on therapy.
Yeah, I'll respond to this. Several years ago, Karina Priyanka and I did some research, and I was focusing on qualitative stuff, and she was focusing primarily on quantitative, and we worked together on a project. And it got really tricky when it came down to like, how do you code? Like when you really think about turning something qualitative into a quantitative code, how do you do it? And we spent hours and hours working through these things, and we ultimately realized that we were kind of on the same page when it came down to what we were doing. And it's because I think we came to the realization that we're both essentially engaged in a hermeneutic endeavor and like doing interpretive work and acknowledging the interpretive work. So my question is that, yeah, I think it's very possible to mix it up in this way, but I think we were able to do that because we had a sort of a fundamental epistemological commitment. Not surprisingly, we were both students of Josh Clegg at the time and had just got through taking a class on hermeneutics. So yeah, I think it actually speaks to the nature of this presentation. I think an underlying epistemological understanding of any nature can probably be the basis. So
if I could just speak to that too, I think one thing that could be helpful is in underscoring how much pluralistic framework and an emphasis on integration is being embraced by philosophers of science in relation to things like biology, right? So just as an example, I don't know if you guys are familiar with this work called Unsimple Truths by Sandra Mitchell, but the whole point is that our understanding of complex systems has itself evolved to the point where we have to rethink this strategy that we've been using for a couple of thousand years and put more emphasis on multi-level analysis. And, if this is true in relation to life sciences, biological sciences, it's sometimes more convincing that it could also be true for a phenomenon like human experience, cognition, so on. So that's just a suggestion. It's also within the, the broader umbrella of philosophy of science, but contemporary philosophy of science too, and what's actually going on and how people are embracing these ideas that, some psychologists still see as controversial.
Michelle has her hand up.
Yeah, go ahead. You can unmute yourself to ask your question, Michelle.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. It's wonderful to see you. And I'm Neil. I'm so glad you brought Maxine into the room. It just brought tears to my eyes. I was lucky enough to be with her in her last moments in the hospital. So anyway, so I love this conversation, and I want to complicate things with social class. So a few years ago, SQUIP invited Sarah McClelland and some others to investigate the question of where qualitative methods courses being taught at undergraduate, and we discovered that they were being taught at mostly elite white private universities, but not at community colleges or working class schools. And I would put, and yet in those spaces, students know that epistemic pluralism exists. They know that double consciousness exists. They know that the singularity of dominant academic discourses is, some game they have to learn to play, but it's not the only way to see the world. And so I wonder, in the conversations about textbooks and how do we teach, how do we think about the really grotesque stratification of who has access to thinking critically about knowledge production. Mostly it's a thank you to all of you, but I think we have to think of being a CUNY after being a Penn just reminds me of who has access to the complicated thinking that you're all offering, especially because working class students already know something is wrong with academic knowledge. Javier, nice to meet you. I know everybody else.
And that's a long-standing issue, I think, in psychology in general. You know, like I remember reading a historical analysis of it was like employee evaluations that psychologists do for HR, and one of the conclusions that they drew was that the sort of nuanced, really qualitative approach was what they used for executives, but the sort of standardized, you know, like forced choice, you know, scaled response, that's what they use for the masses, the employees. So yeah, I think that's just one example, but I think that's the general pattern in the discipline, that there can be nuance and complexity, but sometimes it's only available for those who can afford it.
Yeah.
So when Linda and I started thinking about this presentation, we actually started it from a very pragmatic place, like literally, like, how do we start talking about this? And I've been stuck. I haven't had much movement, but I started to have something occurring today, and I'm not sure it's, you know, it's just rising up now, and I'm sure it's probably on the verge of rambling. But one thing I've noticed that in this presentation, and also recently I attended a presentation on mixing methods, there was no discussion about differentiating science from pseudoscience, which seemed to be occupy a big chunk in these textbooks, sort of making the argument to the reader that you really need to develop a scientific way of thinking in order to sort of discount these forms of pseudoscience. And I just found myself thinking, like, wow, what if that space was used to talk about some of the things we're talking about here, about complex values and thinking about not just dichotomies, but terrains, epistemic terrains. You know, maybe if we discursively stop fighting the fight of pseudoscience versus real science, we might create a little bit more space for having these deeper, more complex discussions. So thank you all for something I've been struggling for a while, which is a very concrete thing to say.
I'm just going to pose this last question in the chat before we wrap up, as we're reaching 8:30. Lucy Thompson asks, I'm wondering how we deal with epistemic violences in the midst of all of this. Can we consider pluralism without considering violences?
Yeah, I don't think so. I don't think we can. I mean, I don't think we can talk about what's at stake epistemically without talking about what's at stake politically, morally, culturally, and socially. And this again is why I think, you know, what Lisa, you know, emphasized about orienting methodological and epistemological questions around value questions can be so powerful, because and I find that it really connects these questions to my students' lives. You know, my students are mostly, the institution I teach at is like 60 or 70% Latinx. Most of them are first or second generation immigrants, first or second generation English speakers. And these, you know, asking questions like who's psychology for, or, you know, who do these questions help? Like, to them, that's their native language. Like that's not a stretch for them to ask that question. They've already been asking that question. You know? So I think it actually is an effective strategy for teaching my students.
Yeah, well, thank you all. I mean, there are so many interesting conversations happening in the chat. I just invite you to take a look at them. There's a question about neutrality as a value and how that fits, you know, methodologically. There's a question of violence as language or other ways to language this phenomenon. So, I mean, this could go on, and we are coming to an end, but I kind of just want to end with this idea that, you know, oftentimes what's standing out for me is that we can miss the forest for the trees. That phrase just kept coming up while I'm listening and learning from each of you tonight. And really what I might take when, you know, with my students of undergrad and graduate schools is your advice to engage students at the upfront with a rigorous discussion of values and also agendas or aims, as well as a question of how it is that each of us come to know what we know. I love the idea of ancestral knowing that I think Javier, you had brought up, and also the multidisciplinary studies as a way to engage across this, almost like a building of a methodological solidarities project. And so I just really want to thank you. I mean, my mind is just churning with bigger picture questions, as I'm sure many of ours are. And so I wish we could just keep the conversation going. Linda, you had mentioned that you wish there was a hub for us to be able to trade what we're doing in the classroom curricula. And I'm hoping, you know, of course, I think all of us are, that SQIP can continue to facilitate that kind of hub. So maybe there is an ability to have a round 2 of this with more specific examples, or, you know, we can keep the conversations going. But, you know, thank you for each of you that has come to this conversation tonight. Thank you for the panelists for sharing your wisdom. And the video recording will be up in just a few days, and we will absolutely find ways to keep this conversation going. It's just so important, and it's an ongoing one across the generations of psychologists, actually. So thank you. And thank you everybody for showing up tonight. I hope you guys have a wonderful rest of your days. Be well.
Thank you, Nisha.
Thank you,
Thanks,
Nisha.
everyone.
Nisha. Thank you all.